There's a long history of these sorts of episodes going back decades, if not a century. So it's really coming out of something that's fundamental to the structure of the Big Four today. Having said that, the PwC people are right to be worried because it is pretty serious, and it seems to have really galvanised people's thinking about the Big Four and what people ask them to do and what sorts of things that happen inside the firms. So they're right to be worried.
Well, let's talk about that fundamental structure that you mentioned there. Ian, Jim Chalmers has said that he's displeased with PwC and is considering further action. What does this incident say about the relationship of these large consulting firms and governments? I mean, are they intrinsically always going to be conflicted?
I mean, yeah, there's always going to be issues. I mean, clearly the government is a big customer, a big client of these firms. But I think that also speaks to the risks, right? These firms are in such diverse areas of business, whether it's with business, whether it's with the government, that an incident like this, which basically creates reputational risk that applies to, was it one partner? Was it 7 partners? Was it 30 partners? We're not sure at this stage, but it's thousands of people whose livelihood is potentially affected by the potential consequences that the government might take in response to this.
Well, let's talk about some of those potential consequences, Stuart. If the penalties in this country were perhaps stronger, would this type of behaviour be prevented? I mean, what goes on overseas?
Well, there's all sorts of different kinds of consequences, including direct legal and financial ones, but also, in the case of Australia, the potential for an anti-corruption lens to be applied to it. Through the history of Big Four tax scandals, there's been all sorts of consequences, but also a reluctance to go too hard against the Big Four because they're so concentrated and so, all-pervading. There was a fear, for example, in 2005, when KPMG were at the centre of a big tax scandal in the US, there was a fear that if it was criminally prosecuted, we'd end up with the Big Three. Now, I think Ian and I would argue that it's a false analogy to think of these organisations as systemically important or as too big to fail. They're not too big to fail. They are very big, but they can fail, as Arthur Andersen showed. And it would be wrong to think that they perform an essential systemic function, because actually what they do is very contestable.
So, Ian, then how do you think about starting to fix the system? Because the government, you would presume, will always need some level of external consultation when creating policy.
Right. So I think part of it is just, are these firms too big? Are they in too many businesses? And so one possibility that's been talked about, EY was sort of certainly pursuing this, so the idea is splitting up into multiple firms so that some of the conflicts are resolved structurally in some ways. And part of that was not only coming from EY itself, but there's been discussion among regulators in the US, in the UK in particular, that there are these conflicts that maybe need to be addressed through structural remedies, and that's certainly one remedy that might be considered in the Australian context.
Stuart, what are some of the other new frontiers that might exist when it comes to strengthening integrity in auditing?
Well, 100% the idea of splitting auditing, which is fundamentally a pro-social activity, from things like aggressive tax avoidance advice, which is essentially an antisocial activity. So structural remedies are very important. But we shouldn't be reluctant to apply a very high standard of integrity to these organisations and to pursue, exactly as Senator O'Neill is doing now, to pursue them very, very rigorously. So there's things that people have proposed in the past. For example, if a large professional services firm is engaging in inappropriate conduct, banning them from government work and having other kinds of sanctions, but also thinking about the clients, because the clients are the ones that are looking to the Big Four for this kind of advice, and then they're also looking to engage with governments. So in the UK, in one of the big tax scandals there was a push to say, well, companies that are engaged in the Big Four for aggressive tax advice should be banned from working with government as well.
Ian, can the Big Four be trusted?
I think the Big Four can be trusted if they have the right sort of incentives to be trusted. So, I mean, they started out to a large extent as audit businesses, sort of focused on sort of this reputation for probity, for ensuring that the financial reporting was done in an appropriate fashion. But what we've seen in recent years is the firms have grown dramatically. Three of the big four actually spun off their consulting practices around 2002, 2003 timeframe, but they've now gone back into that business and has grown rapidly, much more rapidly than sort of the core historical part of their business. And I think those conflicts are leading to the big four into situations where perhaps they can't be trusted. And I think structural remedies will be something that's sort of put back onto the table that the firms themselves might be looking at this stage.
Stuart, what next for PwC?
Well, they're very much in damage control. I don't want to say too much about PwC specifically because Ian and I are historians of the Big Four in general. Some of the things that they're doing are obviously very sensible, so engaging people to look at culture and those sorts of things. But the risk is that they won't look at the fundamental conflicts, and it's really, really hard to change those things in the Big Four because they don't have a conventional corporate structure. They have what's essentially a franchise structure. So things like head offices and brands are owned jointly by the national practices. So doing things like what EY plan to do with the demerger is extremely difficult because you need to get the different national practices to cooperate. So unwinding or fundamentally changing systems, integrity, is very, very difficult in the model that we've got at the moment for the Big Four. So one of the things that Ian and I have said is they really need to think about different models, possibly corporate models, certainly structural change. But again, getting agreement from the Big Four to do that voluntarily is extremely difficult.
Ian Gow and Stuart Kells, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Kath. It was brilliant.
Thanks, Kath.